They were erased. Not defeated, not forgotten, erased. An empire that ruled kings and bent the Bronze Age to its will vanished so completely that for 3,000 years no living soul even remembered its name. Their capital, Hattusa, once a furnace of power, smoldered into silence, its walls swallowed by stone and time, scrolls and tablets shattered. Their gods, thousands of them, went mute. Even Egypt, their greatest rival, wrote of their strength in trembling ink, but their story dissolved into dust. And then nothing. The world moved on, as if they had never existed. But they had. The Hittites carved roads through Anatolia, ruled half the known world, and fought Ramses II at Kadesh with chariots that thundered like storms. They signed the first peace treaty ever written. They mastered iron when others still clutched bronze. And then, like a candle crushed under a fist, they disappeared. No survivors to tell their story. No whispers of their fall. A silence so absolute it warped history itself. When archaeologists cracked open their clay archives in the 20th century, it was like hearing a dead empire scream. Names of kings bled through cuneiform tablets. Forgotten cities exhaled dust. And the truth clawed its way out of the grave. In the late 19th century, when the great powers of Europe were carving up history through archaeology, Anatolia seemed an afterthought. A rugged plateau, remote and impenetrable, known for scattered ruins that hinted at forgotten kingdoms. Yet it was there, among the hills of north-central Anatolia, that a buried world waited in silence. In 1834, French archaeologist Charles Texier first set foot in the quiet village of Bogoskoy. He was seeking relics of ancient Tyria, a city mentioned by Herodotus, but what he found defied easy explanation. Colossal stone fortifications, monumental gateways carved with lions, and stretches of ruined walls winding across the hills. No known civilization could be tied to this place. There were no inscriptions in familiar scripts, no chronicles linking these ruins to the empires of Greece, Rome, or Persia. Texier recorded the site, sketched its strange reliefs, and moved on. For decades, the name Bogoskoy was merely a curiosity in archaeological circles, another nameless ruin in Anatolia's layered history. But the earth had sealed a far older power beneath its soil. The empire buried there had been a superpower of the late Bronze Age, rivaling the might of Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria. For nearly 3,000 years, this empire had been erased so thoroughly that even its name had vanished. The only trace left to posterity was a handful of cryptic references in the Hebrew Bible, where the Hittites appeared fleetingly, mentioned as a people among the land of Canaan, tied to stories of patriarchs and kings, yet with no clear identity. Scholars of the 18th and 19th centuries debated whether these Hittites were a minor Canaanite tribe or a mythologized people. No one suspected that the biblical mentions were the faint echoes of an empire that once dominated half the known world. In the late 19th century, as European archaeologists shifted their focus eastward, German scholar Hugo Winkler became obsessed with Bogoskoy. He was convinced that the ruins concealed more than an isolated fortress. In 1906, after years of planning, Winkler began systematic excavations at the site. What he unearthed stunned the academic world. Beneath centuries of rubble, workers pulled from the earth thousands of clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped characters, cuneiform, but not in Akkadian, the lingua franca of Mesopotamia. These inscriptions carried an unknown language, written in a script familiar in form but alien in voice. The tablets spoke of kings and treaties, gods and empires, but no scholar could yet read their names. Over 10,000 tablets emerged from the ground, each one a voice from a civilization that history had buried. Scholars began to suspect that this was not a forgotten city-state but the capital of an entire empire. In 1915, Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný cracked the code that would rewrite history. Analyzing the inscriptions, he announced a revelation. The language on the tablets was Indo-European, the oldest known example of that vast family of tongues, linked to Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. His breakthrough revealed that these texts belonged to the Hittites, the same people briefly mentioned in Scripture, yet far greater than anyone had imagined. The biblical Hittites were not a minor tribe but the remnants of a collapsed superpower that had once stood as a rival to Egypt itself. The site of Bogoskoy was revealed to be Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. Its massive stone fortifications, stretching over 6 kilometers, bore silent witness to a Bronze Age state of extraordinary sophistication. Within its walls lay royal archives, temples, palaces, and administrative centers. The tablets spoke of a world order that had been forgotten. Vassal kingdoms stretching across Anatolia and northern Syria, alliances and betrayals, trade networks that reached into Mesopotamia and the Aegean. Inscriptions described kings like Suppiluliuma I, who had humbled Egypt's allies, and Muwatalli II, who faced Ramses II at the Battle of Kadesh around 1274 BCE. The Hittites had signed the earliest known peace treaty in history, etched into stone and sealed by gods, a testament to their diplomatic mastery. Yet, for all their might, their empire had dissolved so completely by 1200 BCE that no memory of them remained. Unlike Egypt, which left monuments and a continuous historical record, or Mesopotamia, whose cuneiform tablets littered ruins across Iraq and Syria, the Hittites vanished from human memory. Their cities were abandoned, their archives buried, their people scattered. Even their language disappeared from living speech, preserved only in those tablets sealed by fire and rubble. By the time Assyrian scribes chronicled their conquests centuries later, the Hittites were no longer an empire but a vague recollection. Over time, even that faded. By the first millennium BCE, the very name of the Hittites had become little more than a biblical reference. Hattusa's rediscovery transformed our understanding of the Late Bronze Age. The geography that once hid them was both their greatest strength and ultimate weakness. Their empire sat on the Anatolian Plateau, a highland fortress stretching between the Black Sea to the north and the Mediterranean to the south. This rugged land, crisscrossed with mountains and valleys, made Anatolia a natural crossroads of trade and empire. Control of this plateau gave the Hittites access to routes leading west toward the Aegean, south toward Syria, and east toward Mesopotamia. The very terrain that made their capital defensible also helped erase them from history. Unlike Egypt's river-fed Nile Valley, where stone monuments survived millennia, Anatolia's highlands were less forgiving. Over centuries, earth and vegetation reclaimed Hattusa's walls, sealing its archives beneath layers of soil. The excavations revealed a civilization both militaristic and bureaucratic. The Hittites had developed one of the most sophisticated administrative systems of their age, ruling a vast network of vassal kings and governors who swore loyalty to the great king in Hattusa. They had mastered siege warfare and chariot tactics, their armies fielding thousands of war chariots, each a technological marvel of the Bronze Age. Yet their empire was not built on brute force alone. Diplomacy was their weapon of choice. Treaties were meticulously written, invoking divine witnesses, binding kings through elaborate oaths. This legalistic mindset extended even to their religion. They worshipped a pantheon so vast that scribes referred to it as the 1,000 gods of Hutti, a fusion of Hattion, Hurrian, and Mesopotamian deities, reflecting their cosmopolitan empire. The Hittites were not an isolated culture but part of a vast interconnected world. Their archives mention correspondence with Egypt's pharaohs, Babylon's kings, and Assyria's rising rulers. They played a decisive role in shaping the geopolitics of the 14th and 13th centuries BCE. Yet for all this sophistication, they left no living tradition to carry their memory forward. When the empire collapsed during the Late Bronze Age upheavals around 1200 BCE, an era marked by famine, internal revolt, and invasions from mysterious sea peoples, Hattusa was burned and abandoned. The survivors retreated into small Neo-Hittite states scattered across northern Syria and southern Anatolia, but over the next centuries even these fell to the Assyrians. By 700 BCE, the Hittites had vanished entirely from the historical record. When Winkler's team began deciphering the archives of Hattusa in the early 20th century, it was as if an entire chapter of human history had been torn from obscurity and thrust into the light. The tablets not only confirmed the Hittite Empire's existence, but reconstructed an entire forgotten world. For centuries, biblical scholars had speculated on who the Hittites were. Now archaeology revealed that they had once stood shoulder to shoulder with the greatest empires of antiquity. The rediscovery forced historians to rewrite the political map of the Late Bronze Age, revealing a three-way struggle for dominance between Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. The ruins of Hattusa still stand today in Turkey's Çorum province, their monumental gateways guarded by weathered lions and sphinxes, remnants of an empire that had once terrified its enemies and commanded vassals across continents. These stones had remained silent for over 2 millennia, yet beneath them lay an archive that spoke more clearly than any living memory. What the world had forgotten, the earth had preserved, waiting for the day when spades and scholars would bring an empire back into history's gaze. At the dawn of the 2nd millennium BCE, Anatolia was not yet a land of empires. It was a fractured landscape of fortified city-states, each perched atop rocky outcrops, guarded by walls of stone and timber, their power measured in grain stores, cattle herds, and war chariots. The land was divided between cultures that had long called the plateau home: the Hattians, whose language was neither Semitic nor Indo-European, and who built their cities in central Anatolia; the Hurrians, whose influence seeped in from the southeast; and the rising tide of Indo-European speakers, a people whose origins lay far to the north or east and whose arrival would alter the balance of power. By around 2000 BCE, waves of Indo-European settlers were pushing into Anatolia, their language and customs gradually mixing with those of the indigenous populations. The land of Hutti, named for the Hattians, became the crucible in which a new culture began to take shape, one that would one day forge an empire. Trade connected these cities long before conquest united them. Merchants from Assyria established a vast network of trading colonies across Anatolia, known as Kerem, where they exchanged tin, textiles, and luxury goods for silver and other resources. The most important of these colonies was Kerem Kanesh, near modern-day Kultepe, a hub that flourished between 1950 and 1850 BCE. In Kanesh, archaeologists have unearthed tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets, written in Old Assyrian, that detail contracts, shipments, loans, and family correspondence. These texts provide one of the earliest glimpses into the societies of Anatolia, revealing a world where trade caravans moved under armed protection, merchant families conducted international business, and local kings negotiated alliances and rivalries in writing. The presence of Assyrian traders introduced cuneiform script to Anatolia, allowing native rulers to develop their own administrative systems, laying the foundation for the Hittite bureaucratic tradition. Among these local rulers emerged a figure whose name marked a turning point in Anatolia's history: Anita, son of Pithana, king of Kasara. In the early 18th century BCE, Anita waged a relentless campaign to dominate central Anatolia. The Anita text, written in Old Hittite cuneiform, is one of the oldest known Indo-European inscriptions and recounts his conquests with precision. He captured the city of Hattusa, a powerful stronghold in the heart of Hattian territory, and razed it, uttering a curse that whoever rebuilt it would suffer divine wrath. His words etched into clay carried weight for centuries, for Hattusa would later rise again, but only after Anita's dynasty had faded. From Kasara, Anita extended his control over neighboring cities, including Kanesh, and proclaimed himself Great King, a title that foreshadowed the imperial power of the Hittites to come. Though Anita's kingdom was short-lived, his campaigns marked the first attempt to unite the fractured lands of Anatolia under a single ruler. The Anatolia of this period was a mosaic of cultural exchange. Hattian religious traditions, rich with local deities tied to mountains, rivers, and storms, mingled with Indo-European elements brought by the newcomers. Hurrian influences, carried from the southeast, added another layer, particularly in art, music, and religious ceremonies. This fusion of cultures produced a pantheon that would later be called the Thousand Gods of Hutti, a reflection of the empire's syncretic character. Cities like Kanesh were cosmopolitan centers where local elites intermarried with Assyrian traders, and the spread of writing revolutionized governance, allowing kings to issue decrees, record treaties, and manage complex trade networks with unprecedented precision. Yet power was unstable, and the kingdoms of this era were as fragile as they were ambitious. The collapse of Anita's dynasty around the mid-17th century BCE returned Anatolia to a patchwork of rival states. Hattusa, once cursed and abandoned, remained a contested site, valued for its commanding position overlooking trade routes. The city was eventually reoccupied by a new dynasty that traced its roots to Kasara. One of the earliest rulers of this new line was Labarna I, whose reign marked the beginning of what historians now call the Old Hittite Kingdom. His successor, Hattusili I, would later rebuild Hattusa and make it the capital of a rising power, but this ascent was not immediate. The early kings ruled over a land still fractured by local rivalries, where loyalty was tenuous, and the great powers of Mesopotamia viewed Anatolia as a distant frontier rather than a serious rival. The survival of texts from this period provides a rare window into the earliest phases of Hittite statecraft. Written in an early form of the Hittite language, these tablets document military campaigns, royal edicts, and religious rites, demonstrating a society already skilled in record-keeping. The adaptation of cuneiform writing from Assyria was transformative. Local scribes modified the script to suit their own language, producing administrative documents that allowed rulers to consolidate power more effectively. Temples and palaces became centers not only of worship but of governance, housing archives that recorded everything from tribute payments to treaties. The Hittite kings saw themselves as chosen by the gods, but their legitimacy also rested on their ability to enforce order in a politically volatile landscape. The Indo-European migration into Anatolia remains one of the defining events of this era. Linguistic evidence indicates that Hittite, Loian, and Palaic, the primary languages of Anatolia's Indo-European elite, had branched off from Proto-Indo-European earlier than most other known languages. The arrival of these groups was not a sudden invasion but a gradual movement over centuries, resulting in a cultural blend rather than outright displacement of the Hattian population. Archaeological evidence shows continuity in material culture, suggesting that Indo-European newcomers adopted many local traditions, even as they introduced their own. This cultural synthesis would define Hittite identity for centuries, making their empire one of the most diverse and adaptable states of the Bronze Age. The story of this early kingdom is also a story of collapse. By around 1650 BCE, the Hittite state entered a period of instability that nearly erased it before it could rise again. Internal revolts, succession crises, and conflicts with neighboring states weakened its rulers. The kingdom that Anita had forged disintegrated, and Hattusa itself became vulnerable to enemy attacks. Yet this era of turmoil would lay the groundwork for a stronger resurgence. In the chaos, new rulers consolidated power, reorganized the administration, and expanded their military capabilities. The old Hittite kingdom that emerged from this crucible was no longer a fragile coalition of city-states, but a centralized state poised for expansion. The rise of Hattusa as a capital was a turning point. Its strategic location at the heart of the Anatolian plateau gave the Hittites control over crucial trade routes linking the Aegean to Mesopotamia and the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. The rugged terrain around Hattusa offered natural defenses, while the fertile valleys nearby provided resources to sustain a growing population. Under Hattusili I, the city became not only a military stronghold but also an administrative and religious center, its archives growing into one of the largest collections of cuneiform tablets in the ancient world. The kings who ruled from Hattusa inherited a legacy of cultural blending, political ambition, and administrative innovation, all forged during this formative period. The transformation from a land of scattered city-states to a centralized kingdom was neither smooth nor inevitable. It was the product of centuries of migration, warfare, trade, and adaptation. The Indo-European elite built upon the traditions of the Hattians and Hurrians, incorporating their gods, their customs, and their knowledge. The Assyrian merchants who had brought cuneiform script to Anatolia unwittingly gave the Hittites the tools to record their history and legitimize their authority. The memory of Anita's campaigns and his curse on Hattusa lingered as a reminder of the volatility of power in Anatolia, even as new kings defied that curse and rebuilt the city into a capital that would one day stand at the center of a vast empire. The transformation of Anatolia from a fractured land of rival city-states into a centralized kingdom began under a ruler whose name became synonymous with power, Hattusili I. Rising to the throne around 1650 BCE, he inherited a fragile state, one that had emerged from centuries of turbulence. The cities of central Anatolia had seen kings rise and fall, their alliances shifting with every generation, their loyalties uncertain. Hattusili's reign marked the decisive turning point when this unstable kingdom began to consolidate its strength, not through gradual diplomacy alone, but through relentless military campaigns, administrative restructuring, and an ideology that fused religion with kingship. His decision to rebuild Hattusa as his capital, defying the ancient curse pronounced by Anita, was both practical and symbolic. It placed the Hittite throne at the heart of Anatolia, in a fortress-like city encircled by steep hills and stone walls that would later stretch over 6 kilometers. From this base, Hattusili launched a campaign of conquest that brought the Hittites into contact and conflict with some of the most powerful states of the Bronze Age. The reign of Hattusili I is documented in detail through the Annals of Hattusili, a rare autobiographical royal inscription in which the king himself recounts his campaigns. These texts reveal a ruler who viewed his authority as divinely sanctioned, presenting himself as chosen by the gods to bring order to a fractured world. In his annals, he describes military expeditions that reached far beyond Anatolia, striking deep into northern Syria, a region of immense strategic value. Northern Syria was a land of fortified cities, rich agricultural plains, and access to Mediterranean trade routes. Controlling it meant controlling the vital arteries of commerce and diplomacy that connected Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and Egypt. Hattusili's campaigns brought him into confrontation with the powerful kingdom of Yamhed, centered at Aleppo, and marked the beginning of a long struggle between the Hittites and the established powers of the Near East. The military machine that carried the Hittites to dominance was unlike anything Anatolia had seen before. Hattusili's forces were built upon innovations in chariot warfare, a technology that revolutionized Bronze Age combat. The Hittite chariot was lighter and more maneuverable than those of their rivals, designed to carry 3 warriors instead of 2, a driver, a shield-bearer, and a spear thrower or archer. This allowed for greater offensive capability and battlefield endurance, giving the Hittite army an advantage in both speed and striking power. The state invested heavily in this new form of warfare, training specialized units and constructing roads to move chariots rapidly across their rugged homeland. Hattusili's ability to mobilize these forces over long distances was a testament to the growing administrative sophistication of the Hittite state. His campaigns stretched the kingdom's resources, but they also forged a military tradition that would define the Hittite Empire for centuries. Hattusili's expansion was not limited to conquest. It was accompanied by the deliberate construction of a political and administrative system that could support an empire. The Hittite kings built a centralized bureaucracy, headquartered in Hattusa, with scribes trained in cuneiform script. Borrowing heavily from the administrative practices of Mesopotamia, they recorded treaties, tax records, military rosters, and religious texts, creating one of the most extensive archival traditions of the ancient world. The early Hittite legal code, likely formalized during this period, reflects a society that valued law and precedent. Unlike the harsh retributive justice of Hammurabi's Babylon, Hittite law emphasized compensation over corporal punishment, illustrating a pragmatic approach to governance. Fines were commonly imposed for crimes such as theft or assault, and capital punishment was rare, often reserved for treason or offenses against the royal family. This legal tradition would remain remarkably consistent for centuries, a stabilizing force in a state that constantly faced external pressures. Hattusili's reign was not without turmoil. His annals provide a rare glimpse into the political instability that haunted the early Hittite state. He faced rebellions from vassal rulers and dissent within his own family. In one striking episode, Hattusili removed his designated heir, his sister's son, citing disloyalty, and instead named his own grandson, Mursili, as successor. This decision foreshadowed the dynastic tensions that would repeatedly threaten the Hittite throne. Yet Hattusili's personal authority remained unchallenged until his death. His legacy was not only territorial expansion but also the creation of a political framework that allowed his successors to continue his work. Upon Hattusili's death around 1620 BCE, Mursili I inherited a kingdom that was no longer a minor Anatolian power but a rising force in Near Eastern politics. Mursili extended his grandfather's campaigns further than any Hittite ruler before him. In a bold and unprecedented strike, he marched an army nearly 800 kilometers southeast, through hostile territory, and captured Babylon itself around 1595 BCE. This stunning campaign ended the old Babylonian dynasty of Hammurabi and shocked the political order of Mesopotamia. Yet Mursalai's conquest of Babylon was not intended for permanent occupation. The logistical challenges of holding such a distant city made withdrawal inevitable. Instead, the raid demonstrated the reach and military capability of the Hittites. It also destabilized Mesopotamia, paving the way for the rise of the Kassite dynasty in Babylon. Mursalai's assassination shortly after his return to Hattusa plunged the kingdom into political chaos. Court factions vied for power, leading to a period of instability and internal strife. Yet even amid turmoil, the foundations laid by Hattusili I endured. The administrative system, fortified capital, and legal traditions provided continuity through dynastic upheavals. Kings like Telepinu, who reigned in the early 16th century BCE, sought to restore order by issuing the Edict of Telepinu, a proclamation that codified royal succession laws and sought to prevent further bloodshed among the nobility. This edict stands as one of the earliest constitutional documents in history, illustrating the Hittites' unique approach to law and governance. The expansion into Syria during this period was not merely territorial ambition. It reflected the interconnected world of the Late Bronze Age. Northern Syria was a battleground between the Hittites and the Kingdom of Yamhad, with its capital at Aleppo. The Hittites' repeated campaigns in this region demonstrated their determination to control the trade routes that linked Anatolia to the wealth of Mesopotamia and the Levant. Control over these cities also brought the Hittites into indirect contact with Egypt, which was beginning to assert influence over Canaan. By the 15th century BCE, the Hittites had positioned themselves as a major power in the northern Levant. Though their empire remained vulnerable to internal discord, the military campaigns of Hattusili and Mursalai were made possible by innovations in logistics and state organization. Roads were built and maintained to facilitate the movement of armies and supplies. The Hittites developed a system of royal storehouses and supply depots to support long-distance campaigns. Their chariot corps, supported by infantry trained to fight alongside these mobile units, allowed them to wage war over vast distances. The empire's reliance on vassal kings and tributary states also reflects a pragmatic approach to governance. Instead of attempting direct control over every conquered territory, the Hittites integrated local rulers into their political structure through treaties and marriage alliances, securing loyalty through both diplomacy and military force. The consolidation of power under Hattusili I and his successors marked the transition of the Hittites from a regional Anatolian kingdom to a formidable imperial state. Their legal code, diplomatic innovations, and military advancements set them apart from their contemporaries. The Hittite king was more than a warrior. He was a high priest, diplomat, and lawgiver. Religious authority was central to kingship, and royal inscriptions often invoked the gods as witnesses to treaties and laws. This integration of divine sanction with political power strengthened the king's authority while providing a moral and religious framework for governance. The Hittites' rise during this period reflected the complex geopolitics of the Late Bronze Age. The collapse of Babylon's old dynasty created a power vacuum in Mesopotamia, while Egypt was still consolidating its power under the early New Kingdom. Anatolia, once seen as a peripheral region, emerged as a center of military and political innovation. The kings of Hattusa used their strategic location to control trade routes, exert influence over neighboring regions, and challenge the supremacy of older civilizations. Their empire, forged through relentless campaigns and calculated diplomacy, was becoming an equal to Egypt and Assyria, signaling a new balance of power in the ancient Near East. By the mid-14th century BCE, the Hittites were no longer a regional power struggling for survival. They were an empire standing shoulder to shoulder with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria, commanding vast territories and reshaping the political landscape of the Late Bronze Age. At the center of this transformation stood Suppiluliuma I, a ruler whose brilliance in war and diplomacy propelled the Hittites into an era of unprecedented dominance. His reign, beginning around 1344 BCE, marked a decisive turning point. He inherited a kingdom that had endured internal crises and external threats, but had stabilized under Tudhaliya III. Suppiluliuma was no cautious caretaker of this stability. He was a conqueror and strategist who would expand Hittite power beyond anything his predecessors had achieved. Suppiluliuma's campaigns systematically dismantled the long-standing power of Mitanni, a Hurrian kingdom that had dominated northern Syria for centuries. Through a combination of military might and shrewd diplomacy, he broke Mitanni's network of alliances, first by negotiating with vassals, then by striking at its core. The conquest of Carchemish and Aleppo, two of the most strategically important cities in northern Syria, was decisive. Carchemish, situated on the Euphrates River, became a Hittite administrative center and a gateway to Mesopotamia. Aleppo, once a symbol of Hurrian dominance, became a testament to Hittite supremacy in the region. Suppiluliuma's victories shattered Mitanni's power, leaving Assyria and Egypt as the Hittites' only true rivals. The expansion into Syria was not simply territorial ambition, but a calculated move to control the vital trade routes linking Anatolia, Mesopotamia, and the Levant. Northern Syria's rich agricultural land, fortified cities, and economic wealth provided the Hittites with resources that sustained their growing empire. Suppiluliuma's diplomacy matched his military skill. He secured loyalty from newly conquered territories through treaties that were meticulously recorded in cuneiform. These treaties bound vassal kings to the great king of Hittite, often sealed with oaths sworn before the gods. Vassal rulers were required to pay tribute, provide military assistance, and recognize Hattusa's supremacy, but they retained a degree of autonomy, making the Hittite Empire a vast network of alliances rather than a rigidly centralized state. The sophistication of this vassal system was unique among Bronze Age empires. The Hittite kings ruled not only through force but through law, creating a diplomatic infrastructure that allowed them to govern lands stretching from Anatolia's highlands to the Levantine coast. Vassal treaties often included clauses regulating succession, prohibiting alliances with foreign powers, and guaranteeing protection under the authority of the Hittite king. By institutionalizing these agreements, the Hittites established a system of governance that was remarkably stable given the geopolitical volatility of the late Bronze Age. Suppiluliuma's reign also demonstrated the Hittites' ability to exploit the weaknesses of their rivals. Egypt, under Akhenaten, was preoccupied with religious reform and internal affairs, allowing Hittite influence to expand unchallenged in Syria. The Amarna letters, a cache of diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and its vassal states, reveal the growing anxiety of Egyptian allied rulers as Hittite armies swept through the region. Suppiluliuma's campaigns reshaped the political map, and by the time of his death, Hittite stood as a dominant power from Anatolia to the Euphrates. The reach of the Hittites extended further through a remarkable diplomatic episode involving Egypt. After the sudden death of Pharaoh Tutankhamun around 1323 BCE, his widow, referred to in Hittite records as Dakamunzu, sent a desperate plea to Suppiluliuma, asking for one of his sons to become her husband and Egypt's pharaoh. This unprecedented request reflected Egypt's vulnerability and Hittite prestige. Suppiluliuma agreed and sent his son Zenanza to Egypt, but the prince was murdered en route, likely in a coup by Egypt's new rulers. The incident triggered a retaliatory Hittite campaign into Egyptian-controlled territories in Syria, further cementing Hittite dominance. Yet this expansion came at a cost. Egyptian prisoners taken during these campaigns carried a plague that spread through Anatolia, killing thousands and likely claiming Suppiluliuma's own life. His son, Mursalai II, ascended the throne in a time of crisis but proved himself an able ruler. Mursalai reigned from around 1321 to 1295 BCE and spent his early years consolidating power internally. His annals record campaigns against rebellious vassals and incursions from neighboring tribes, reflecting his determination to stabilize the empire. He successfully crushed revolts in Arzawa, a powerful state in western Anatolia, and reasserted Hittite authority over territories won by his father. Mursalai's leadership was marked by relentless military activity, but he also strengthened the empire's administrative foundations. Hattusa during this period became one of the most sophisticated capitals of the ancient world. Its massive fortifications, palaces, and temples testified to Hittite power, while its archives, containing tens of thousands of clay tablets, made it a hub of bureaucratic activity. The Hittites maintained meticulous records of treaties, laws, inventories, and religious texts, creating a written legacy unparalleled in its scope. Scribes trained in both Hittite and Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the Near East, managed correspondence with Egypt, Assyria, and Babylon. The empire's complex administration relied on a hierarchy of officials, governors, and military commanders, demonstrating a degree of centralization rare in the ancient world. Religion was inseparable from governance, and the Hittite pantheon reflected the empire's cosmopolitan nature. Known as the Thousand Gods of Hittite, it was a collection of deities adopted from conquered peoples, each incorporated into the empire's religious framework. The storm god Tarhuna stood at the head of this pantheon, but deities from Hurrian, Hattion, and Mesopotamian traditions held prominent places. This religious inclusivity was not merely tolerance. It was a deliberate political strategy, integrating local cultures into the empire while legitimizing Hittite authority. Temples served as centers of both worship and administration, symbolizing the fusion of religion and statecraft. The culmination of Hittite power came under Muwatalli II, who reigned from approximately 1295 to 1272 BCE and faced the greatest external challenge of his dynasty: Egypt's resurgence under Ramses II. The rivalry between Hittite and Egypt reached its climax at the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BCE on the Orontes River. Kadesh was one of the largest chariot battles in history, involving thousands of troops and hundreds of chariots on each side. Ramses II, leading the Egyptian forces, narrowly avoided disaster when Hittite forces ambushed his army. Despite Egyptian propaganda claiming victory, the battle was effectively a stalemate. Kadesh remained under Hittite influence, and the confrontation demonstrated that neither empire could decisively defeat the other. What followed was a diplomatic achievement unparalleled in antiquity. The Hittite-Egyptian peace treaty, signed around 1259 BCE between Hattusili III and Ramses II, is the earliest known surviving peace treaty in world history. Written in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform, it established a permanent alliance between the two great powers. The treaty outlined mutual defense obligations, extradition agreements, and dynastic marriages, symbolizing a new era of international diplomacy. Its preservation on stone stele in Egypt and clay tablets in Hattusa is a testament to the sophistication of Hittite diplomacy and their commitment to law and precedent. Under rulers like Suppiluliuma I, Mursalai II, and Hattusili III, the Hittite Empire reached its territorial and political zenith. At its height, it controlled Anatolia, northern Syria, and parts of Mesopotamia, holding sway over a vast network of vassal states. Its armies, bureaucrats, and diplomats shaped the balance of power in the Late Bronze Age. The empire's influence extended beyond military conquest. It was a cultural and political force that rivaled Egypt's grandeur and Assyria's rising power. Through a combination of strategic warfare, legal innovation, and diplomatic mastery, the Hittites secured their place among the superpowers of their age, leaving behind an enduring legacy inscribed on clay and stone, preserved in archives that chronicled every campaign, treaty, and royal decree with meticulous detail. By the turn of the 13th to 12th century BCE, the Hittite Empire, once the master of Anatolia and a rival to Egypt, stood on the brink of collapse. The great fortress of Hattusa, with its monumental gates and sprawling archives, presided over an empire that had endured centuries of war, diplomacy, and political intrigue. Yet beneath the surface of its administrative brilliance and military prestige, pressures were mounting that would tear the empire apart. The world of the Late Bronze Age, a network of kingdoms bound by trade, treaties, and shared culture, was entering its final violent phase. The empire's decline was neither sudden nor caused by a single event. By the reign of Tudhaliya IV, who ruled from roughly 1237 to 1209 BCE, cracks in the imperial system were already evident. Successors of Suppiluliuma and Mursalai II inherited vast territories but faced growing challenges. Assyria, long held in check by Hittite power, began to rise as a formidable opponent. Trade networks that sustained the empire's wealth were destabilized. Grain, copper, tin, and luxury goods moved along routes controlled by multiple kingdoms. When one link faltered, the entire system suffered. Letters from Ugarit, a wealthy Levantine port and Hittite vassal, describe urgent pleas for grain as famine swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Internal strain magnified these external pressures. The vassal system that had once been the empire's strength now became a vulnerability. Distant territories were difficult to control as communication faltered, and loyalty to Hattusa eroded. Treaties, once the foundation of Hittite authority, were no longer guarantees of stability. The administration, remarkable for its complexity, depended on centralized coordination from the capital, but that network was faltering under the weight of crises. Into this weakening political landscape came waves of migrations and invasions. Groups known collectively as the Sea Peoples swept across the eastern Mediterranean, attacking cities and kingdoms from Anatolia to Egypt. Egyptian inscriptions from the reign of Ramses III described these maritime raiders as a coalition of displaced peoples seeking new lands. Their attacks devastated coastal centers, disrupting trade routes and cutting off vital supplies. While the Sea Peoples were not solely responsible for the Hittite collapse, their impact was catastrophic. Hittite vassal states in western Anatolia fell one by one. Ports essential for maritime trade were lost. The empire's logistical infrastructure, its lifeline, was severed. The capital, Hattusa, a city that had taken centuries to build, became a liability in these years of turmoil. Nestled in the rugged highlands of central Anatolia, it had always been strategically secure but logistically challenging. Feeding its population required steady agricultural output from surrounding lands and a stable administrative network to coordinate resources. Both collapsed under the strain of famine and war. Archaeological evidence indicates that Hattusa was abandoned and burned in the early 12th century BCE, around 1200 BCE, but the circumstances of its fall remain debated. Some suggest internal rebellion, others point to enemy attack. What is certain is that this once mighty capital was left in ruins, its archives abandoned, its gates toppled. The destruction of Hattusa was not an isolated event. Across the eastern Mediterranean, cities were sacked, palaces burned, and empires dismantled. Mycenaean Greece collapsed, Ugarit was destroyed, Kassite Babylon fell into turmoil, and Egypt narrowly survived multiple invasions. The interconnected system of the Late Bronze Age disintegrated, and with it, the Hittite Empire vanished as a central power. Unlike Egypt or Assyria, which retained continuity despite crisis, the Hittites disappeared almost entirely from the historical record for centuries. What remained of Hittite power did not vanish overnight but fragmented into smaller states. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms, emerging in the aftermath of the collapse, preserved elements of Hittite culture, language, and administration. Cities such as Carchemish, once a crucial Hittite stronghold on the Euphrates, became independent centers of power. These states, located in southern Anatolia and northern Syria, maintained connections to their imperial past through the continued use of Loian hieroglyphic inscriptions and Hittite royal titles. They were successors rather than imitators, carrying forward traditions of monumental art, fortification architecture, and religious practices. Yet they operated on a far smaller scale, their authority limited to city-states and regional coalitions rather than an empire stretching across continents. The Neo-Hittite kingdoms survived for several centuries, but their existence was overshadowed by the rise of new imperial powers. By the 9th and 8th centuries BCE, the Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded westward, conquering and absorbing these remnants of Hittite civilization. Carchemish fell to Assyria in 717 BCE, marking the definitive end of Hittite political independence. The culture of Hutti, once a dominant force in the ancient world, became part of the Assyrian imperial system. The Hittites as a distinct people disappeared from written history, their name surviving only in passing references by classical authors who knew little of their former greatness. This erasure from memory was as striking as their earlier dominance. For centuries after their fall, the Hittites were forgotten by history, their language unreadable, their monuments unrecognized. The very existence of their empire faded from collective knowledge until the 19th century CE, when archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Hattusa and deciphered cuneiform inscriptions that revealed their story. The discovery that the Hittites had once rivaled Egypt and Babylon shocked historians, who had long assumed that the great powers of the Bronze Age were limited to those civilizations already known from classical sources. The Hittite Empire's sudden reappearance in modern scholarship was as dramatic as its ancient disappearance. The circumstances that led to their downfall are now understood as part of a larger collapse that swept across the entire Eastern Mediterranean world. Environmental factors likely played a role. Evidence of prolonged drought during this period suggests that agricultural production declined, leading to famine and depopulation. Trade disruptions compounded the crisis, and migrations created pressure on established states. For an empire as vast and logistically complex as Hittite, these shocks proved fatal. Without reliable supply chains, a loyal vassal network, and a functioning administrative system, the empire disintegrated. The archaeological record paints a stark picture of this transformation. The monumental gates of Hattusa, adorned with lion and sphinx reliefs, were left standing over an empty city. Thousands of cuneiform tablets remained buried in the ruins, preserving the voices of kings, scribes, and diplomats who had ruled an empire that no longer existed. Temples that once housed the 1,000 gods of Hittite stood silent. The archives that had meticulously recorded treaties and campaigns became a time capsule, locked away by the destruction of the very state that created them. The disappearance of the Hittites from written history was not merely the collapse of a kingdom. It was the erasure of a civilization. For centuries, no one outside Anatolia remembered their kings, their conquests, or their diplomatic achievements. They had been among the architects of the late Bronze Age world, negotiating with pharaohs, waging war against Mitanni and Assyria, and ruling a vast network of states. Yet when their empire crumbled, the memory of their existence dissolved. The ruins of Hattusa lay buried and forgotten, the clay tablets sealed beneath centuries of soil, until their rediscovery more than 3,000 years later revealed the magnitude of what had been lost. The end of the Hittite Empire was not an isolated tragedy but part of a systemic collapse that redefined the ancient Near East. New powers, Assyria, Babylon, and later Persia, would rise in its wake, but the Hittites' sudden disappearance remains one of the most dramatic examples of how even the greatest empires of the ancient world could vanish. Their influence endured silently, preserved in cultural echoes carried forward by successor states, in inscriptions left on stone, and in the buried remains of a civilization that had once been a superpower of its age. For centuries, the Hittites existed only as shadows in scripture, a name that appeared in the Old Testament yet offered no clarity as to who these people were or what role they played in history. Biblical references mention them as a Canaanite tribe, a peripheral people living in the land of promise, but there was no trace of their cities, no inscriptions to testify to their power, no monuments to confirm their existence. Historians in the 18th and early 19th centuries debated whether the Hittites had been a minor tribal group or even a myth invented by biblical authors. By this time, the ruins of Egypt and Mesopotamia had already begun to speak again through the work of archaeologists and philologists, yet Anatolia, the vast plateau that had once been the heart of the Hittite Empire, remained largely unexplored. The silence surrounding the Hittites was almost total, a striking absence from a world where other ancient civilizations were slowly being brought back to life. The first signs that this forgotten people had once been a major power emerged not from the Bible but from scattered inscriptions and stone monuments uncovered in Anatolia. In the early 19th century, European travelers began to stumble upon enigmatic carvings in central and southern Turkey, inscriptions written in a hieroglyphic script no one could read. In 1834, the French archaeologist Charles Texier visited the site of Bagaskoy, a remote village near the Kızılırmak River, and documented vast stone ruins overgrown and abandoned. The massive fortifications and gateways, including what would later be identified as the Lion Gate and the Sphinx Gate, suggested a powerful and sophisticated city. Texier was astounded, yet he could not connect the ruins to any known ancient culture. He speculated that this might have been the ancient city of Tyria, mentioned by Herodotus, but he did not realize he was standing amid the ruins of Hattusa, the once mighty Hittite capital. His reports brought attention to Anatolia's forgotten ruins, but no one yet understood their significance. Over the following decades, more inscriptions were found across Anatolia and northern Syria, including those at Aleppo, Carchemish, and Hamath, carved in a hieroglyphic script distinct from Egyptian hieroglyphs. These monuments hinted at a lost culture with its own artistic and political traditions, but the identity of the builders remained unknown. Some scholars speculated that these were remnants of a people who had bridged the cultures of Mesopotamia and the Aegean, but the absence of decipherable texts left the mystery unsolved. Meanwhile, biblical scholars continued to debate the historical existence of the Hittites. Many believed they had been nothing more than a minor tribe overshadowed by Israel, Egypt, and Mesopotamia. Few could imagine that this obscure biblical name had once belonged to a superpower. The breakthrough came at the dawn of the 20th century, when systematic excavation of Bogazkoy began. In 1906, the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler, working in collaboration with Theodore Macready, undertook large-scale excavations at the site. Winkler's mission was to find evidence linking Bogazkoy to ancient texts, and within months his team unearthed something extraordinary. Thousands of clay tablets written in cuneiform script. These tablets, preserved in palace archives, contained treaties, diplomatic correspondence, laws, and annals of kings. It was immediately clear that they belonged to an advanced civilization with a powerful state bureaucracy. Over the next several excavation seasons, Winkler's team uncovered more than 10,000 tablets, the largest cache of Bronze Age records ever found at that time. The city's true identity was finally revealed. This was Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire. The discovery was a revelation. Far from being a minor tribe mentioned in passing in scripture, the Hittites had been a dominant power of the late Bronze Age, controlling vast territories that stretched from Anatolia to northern Syria and rivaling Egypt and Assyria. The tablets contained treaties with major kingdoms, including the famous peace treaty signed with Egypt after the Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BCE, the earliest known international treaty preserved in history. The Hittites were suddenly recognized as one of the great imperial powers of the ancient Near East, a civilization whose existence had been almost completely erased from memory. Yet another puzzle remained. The tablets were written in a language no one had seen before. It used cuneiform script borrowed from Mesopotamia but represented an unknown tongue. Scholars initially assumed it was a Semitic or Hurrian language, but its structure defied comparison. In 1915, Czech linguist Bedřich Hrozný made a breakthrough that transformed not only the study of the Hittites but also the history of language itself. After painstaking analysis, Hrozný realized that the language was Indo-European, the oldest recorded member of the language family that includes Latin, Greek, Sanskrit, and modern European languages. His famous interpretation of a single sentence, Nu nindoin ezatini waterma ekatini, as "now you will eat bread and drink water," demonstrated that Hittite grammar and vocabulary shared roots with Indo-European languages. This discovery pushed back the timeline of Indo-European linguistic history by a millennium and provided critical insight into the spread of languages in the ancient world. With the decipherment of the language, the contents of the archives came to life. Historians could now read royal decrees, correspondence with foreign kings, detailed treaties, and historical annals. The Hittite kings recorded their military campaigns, religious festivals, and legal codes in extraordinary detail. The tablets revealed a world of complex diplomacy, where the Hittites negotiated with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria as equals. They detailed a sprawling empire ruled through a sophisticated vassal system, with a network of subordinate kings bound by oaths of loyalty to the Hittite Great King. The texts even preserved mythological traditions, rituals, and hymns, providing one of the richest sources of religious history in the ancient Near East. Excavations continued at Bogazkoy throughout the 20th century, led by successive teams of German archaeologists, each season uncovering more evidence of the scale and sophistication of Hittite civilization. The ruins of Hattusa revealed massive city walls stretching over 6 kilometers, monumental gates adorned with lion and sphinx reliefs, vast temple complexes, and palaces built on fortified terraces. The Great Temple alone, dedicated to the storm god Tarhuna and the sun goddess of Irina, was among the largest religious structures of the ancient world. The sheer size of the city and the precision of its urban planning testified to the power of the Hittite state at its height. Meanwhile, inscriptions found across Anatolia and northern Syria began to make sense. The enigmatic hieroglyphic script used on monuments in the Neo-Hittite states was identified as Luwian, a language closely related to Hittite. Scholars could now trace the survival of Hittite traditions long after the fall of the empire around 1200 BCE. Carchemish, for instance, was revealed as a major center of Neo-Hittite culture, linking the forgotten empire with later Assyrian records. By the mid-20th century, the Hittites had moved from obscurity to prominence in the historical narrative of the Bronze Age. Their rediscovery reshaped the understanding of the ancient Near East, revealing a world that had been far more interconnected and politically dynamic than previously imagined. The excavations at Hattusa, recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1986, continue to provide unparalleled insight into Bronze Age statecraft, law, and religion. What began as scattered biblical references and puzzling inscriptions had become one of archaeology's greatest triumphs. A civilization once erased from human memory resurrected through the systematic decoding of stone and clay. The Hittite language, now fully understood, remains a cornerstone of historical linguistics, offering a glimpse into the earliest stages of Indo-European languages. The thousands of tablets, once silent, now speak of an empire that commanded respect from Egypt and Babylon, orchestrated vast military campaigns, and produced some of the earliest codified treaties in human history. The meticulous excavation of Hattusa and the decipherment of its archives transformed a biblical mystery into a historical reality, revealing a Bronze Age empire whose scope and sophistication had been forgotten for over 3,000 years. The Hittites, once reduced to little more than a fleeting biblical reference, stand today as one of the most influential forces of the late Bronze Age, a civilization that shaped diplomacy, warfare, and law in ways that rippled far beyond their fall. Their empire, centered in the fortified city of Hattusa in central Anatolia, rose to prominence in the 17th century BCE and dominated the ancient Near East for nearly 4 centuries, contending with Egypt, Babylon, and Assyria as equals. What makes their legacy so striking is not just their imperial reach, but their intellectual and political sophistication, visible in clay tablets, monumental architecture, and administrative systems that survive long after their empire's collapse. Few civilizations have left behind such a detailed record of statecraft, and fewer still have been so thoroughly erased from historical memory, only to return centuries later as a cornerstone in understanding the ancient world. The Hittites redefined diplomacy in the ancient Near East. Their archives contain over 30 preserved international treaties, a staggering number for a Bronze Age civilization. Among these is the Treaty of Kadesh, concluded in 1259 BCE between Hittite king Hattusili III and Egypt's Ramses II after decades of conflict. This treaty, inscribed on silver tablets in its original form, is one of the earliest surviving examples of a written peace agreement. It outlined mutual defense clauses, formalized borders, and required both empires to extradite political fugitives, demonstrating a level of legal sophistication centuries ahead of its time. Copies were sent to both capitals, with the Egyptian version carved into the walls of Karnak and Luxor temples. The treaty's language reveals a world where diplomacy was as critical as military strength, and where the Hittite state wielded both with mastery. Law was another pillar of their influence. The Hittite legal code, preserved in cuneiform on multiple tablets, reflects a rational and pragmatic system of governance. Unlike the Code of Hammurabi, which relied heavily on capital punishment, Hittite law often substituted fines or restitution for execution, signaling a legal culture more focused on restitution and social stability than fear. Laws regulated everything from land ownership and inheritance to marriage, theft, and assault. Even in cases of violence, penalties were frequently monetary rather than fatal, suggesting a society that valued order through negotiation and compensation. These codes were widely disseminated within the empire, reflecting a bureaucratic structure capable of enforcing legal norms across vast territories. Their diplomatic and legal innovations were supported by an advanced administrative network. The Hittite Empire operated through a system of vassal kings bound by oaths of loyalty to the great king in Hattusa. These treaties, often sealed with elaborate rituals, were as much religious acts as political contracts, invoking the gods of both parties as witnesses. The archives at Hattusa contain correspondence from vassal rulers across Anatolia, northern Syria, and the Levant, offering a rare glimpse into Bronze Age governance. Through this system, the Hittites built a political network that extended their influence far beyond Anatolia's rugged highlands, binding diverse cultures into a coherent imperial framework. Cultural exchange flourished under this imperial system. The Hittites inherited and transformed the traditions of earlier Anatolian cultures while absorbing influences from Mesopotamia and the Levant. Their pantheon was a reflection of this syncretism, incorporating deities from Hurrian, Mesopotamian, and local Anatolian traditions. They referred to themselves as the people of 1,000 gods, and their religious texts reveal a deep concern for ritual precision and divine favor. The great temple of Hattusa, dedicated to the storm god Tarhuna and the sun goddess of Irina, stood at the heart of their capital, serving as a center for both religious and political authority. In their art and architecture, they combined elements of Mesopotamian monumentality with unique Anatolian styles, producing rock sanctuaries like Yazilikaya, where a procession of gods carved into limestone cliffs created a visual narrative of divine order and kingship. Their influence extended even into the structure of Near Eastern diplomacy. Hittite kings corresponded directly with Egyptian pharaohs, Babylonian monarchs, and the rulers of Mitanni, addressing each other as great kings, a formal recognition of equality that reflected a multipolar political world. This club of great powers, as modern historians call it, marked one of the earliest known systems of international relations, with the Hittites playing a central role in its maintenance. The letters found in the Amarna archive in Egypt, written in Akkadian, show Hittite rulers engaging in complex negotiations over marriage alliances, military support, and economic exchange. The Hittite queen Pujahipa, wife of Hattusili III, emerges from these records as one of the most politically active queens of the ancient world, co-ruling with her husband and engaging in correspondence with foreign leaders. Their rediscovery in the 20th century reframed the narrative of the ancient Near East, exposing gaps in historical memory. For centuries, the absence of the Hittites from classical literature allowed their empire to slip into obscurity, overshadowed by Egypt and Mesopotamia. Even Greek historians like Herodotus made no mention of them, and by the time their empire fell around 1200 BCE, they had already been erased from the living memory of subsequent civilizations. The Neo-Hittite city-states of Syria and southern Anatolia carried fragments of their culture forward, but Assyrian domination absorbed and replaced their traditions by the 8th century BCE. The survival of their legacy relied on buried archives and inscriptions waiting to be uncovered by archaeology. When excavations at Hattusa revealed their archives, the narrative of the Bronze Age was rewritten. The Hittites emerged as not only a military power but also a culture that valued treaties, legal codes, and administrative structure. Their Indo-European language provided critical evidence for linguistic history, pushing back the origins of this language family by a millennium. The sheer volume of written material, over 30,000 tablets and fragments unearthed so far, has made them one of the most documented civilizations of the late Bronze Age. Each tablet reflects the inner workings of a society that blended Anatolian traditions with influences from Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Levant, creating a unique political and cultural identity that bridged continents. The ruins of Hattusa themselves speak to their architectural and engineering prowess. Located on a high plateau, the city was encircled by massive stone walls stretching over 6 kilometers, with gates adorned by lions, sphinxes, and protective deities. Administrative buildings and temples occupied the city's upper and lower towns, while granaries and cisterns ensured the capital's survival during sieges. The Great Temple Complex, with its storerooms filled with ritual objects and tablets, demonstrated the integration of religion and governance. Even in ruin, Hattusa conveys the scale and ambition of a people who dominated Anatolia for centuries. Their influence continued long after their disappearance. Neo-Hittite states like Carchemish and Melid preserved elements of Hittite culture into the Iron Age, transmitting artistic and religious traditions to Assyria and later cultures. Assyrian kings borrowed Hittite religious motifs, while Aramean states adapted their monumental sculpture styles. In this way, Hittite ideas survived even as their empire vanished from memory, absorbed into the cultural fabric of the ancient Near East. Their story reveals how history is written not just by survival but by rediscovery. The Hittites had been forgotten for over 2 millennia, erased so thoroughly that even their name was misinterpreted until archaeology restored it to its rightful place. Their rediscovery forced historians to reconstruct an entire chapter of the Bronze Age, revealing a world where Anatolia was not a periphery, but a center of innovation and power. The thousands of tablets from Hattusa remain a monumental archive of statecraft, religion, law, and diplomacy, a library buried under centuries of silence. Their capital, now a UNESCO World Heritage Site, stands as a rare archaeological landscape where a lost empire reemerges in precise detail, its gates and fortifications a testament to a people whose legacy survived in stone and clay long after their voices were silenced.